Welcome to another deep dive. We're going to be looking at Hosea chapter 3, verse 3 today.
Oh, okay.
This is a verse that's really sparked, centuries of debate and reflection.
Right.
We have some really fascinating source material.
Okay.
Not just the biblical text itself, but scholarly articles delving into its historical context.
Right. Yeah.
Different interpretations, even its relevance to, modern relationships.
Yeah, you know what strikes me right away about this verse is how it just throws you right in the middle of a complex situation.
Yeah.
I mean, we meet Hosea, a prophet who's commanded by God to marry a woman named Gomer, knowing that she's going to be unfaithful.
Oh, wow.
And then there's this really potent image in verse 3 of Hosea bringing Gomer back.
Yeah.
Not as a slave, but as his wife again.
Yeah. It's so raw.
It is.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not some idealized love story. This is like betrayal, heartbreak.
Exactly.
This almost impossible demand for forgiveness.
Yeah, and that's where things get really interesting. You see, many scholars believe that arranged marriages were actually pretty common in ancient Israel.
Okay.
So if that was the case with Hosea and Gomer,
Yeah.
it just adds this other layer to this whole story.
Right.
Imagine being bound to somebody,
Yeah.
not by choice,
Right.
but by some societal obligation,
Yeah.
and then facing that level of infidelity.
That raises a really big question.
Yeah.
Does this context change how we understand Hosea's actions at all?
Right.
Was he motivated only by obedience to God, or was there a deeper pre-existing love for Gomer
Yeah.
that fueled his forgiveness?
It's really hard to say for sure,
Yeah.
and that ambiguity is part of what makes this text so compelling.
I agree.
But regardless of what the specific motivations might have been,
Right.
the verse points to something so much larger.
Okay.
This picture of God's relentless pursuit of his people,
His bride.
often referred to as his bride.
Right. And that's a metaphor
Yes.
that we see woven throughout Scripture.
Absolutely.
But what makes this particular instance so unique?
Well, think about the historical context.
Okay.
Israel at this time
Yeah.
was steeped in idolatry,
Right.
repeatedly turning away from God to worship other deities.
Right.
It's almost like they were engaging in spiritual adultery,
Oh, wow.
betraying the covenant they had with God.
And yet, just like Hosea with Gomer,
Mm.
God doesn't just abandon his people.
No,
He calls them back
he does.
time and again,
Yeah.
promising restoration and renewal.
Precisely. And that's where I think the power of Hosea 3.3 lies.
Okay.
It's not just a story about one man's extraordinary forgiveness.
Okay.
It's a glimpse into the very nature of God's love.
Oh, wow.
A love that pursues, redeems, and welcomes back, even in the face of persistent unfaithfulness.
So we're seeing this parallel then between Hosea and Gomer and God and his people.
Yes.
But where does this leave us,
Right.
the listener today?
Yes.
How do we bridge the gap between this ancient text and our own lives?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it leads us to one of the most challenging aspects of this story.
Okay.
The call to live out Hosea's example. We're all called to be reflections of God's love,
Right.
to extend grace and forgiveness even when it feels impossible.
It is easy to talk about forgiveness in the abstract,
It is. Yeah.
But when we're facing real hurt and betrayal in our own relationships,
Yeah.
it's a whole different story.
Totally different.
How do we even begin to apply these ancient principles to our modern lives?
That's where things get really interesting.
I like it.
And that's where our deep dive truly begins.
Love it.
Yeah.
So we're left with this challenge. How do we embody this radical forgiveness in our own lives?
It's a question that's resonated, with believers for centuries.
Right.
And while there's no easy answer, I think Hosea's story offers some valuable insights.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What specifically about his actions can we apply to our own relationships?
Well, one of the key takeaways, I think, is the importance of understanding the depth of God's grace.
Okay.
Hosea didn't just forgive Gomer.
Right.
He actively pursued her,
Wow.
even when she was lost in her own, destructive choices.
Yeah.
He didn't wait for her to clean up her act or prove that she was worthy.
So it's not about setting conditions for forgiveness, but offering it freely,
Exactly.
just as God does for us.
Precisely. And that's where things get really challenging.
Okay.
For us humans. I
Sure.
mean, our natural instinct is often to hold on to the hurt,
Right.
to demand apologies to make people earn our forgiveness.
That's so true. It feels almost counterintuitive to offer forgiveness with no strings attached.
It is counterintuitive
Yeah.
because it goes against our ingrained sense of justice and fairness.
Right.
But here's the thing. God's love operates on a completely different plane.
Right.
It's a love that's not based on merit, but on pure, unadulterated grace.
So how do we bridge that gap between our very human instincts and this concept of grace?
Yeah.
How do we move from a place of hurt and resentment to genuine forgiveness?
It's a process.
Okay.
And it often requires a real shift in perspective.
Yeah.
Instead of focusing on the wrong that's been done to us,
Right.
we can try to see the situation through a lens of compassion.
Okay.
Ask ourselves what might have led this person to act the way they did.
Right.
What pain or brokenness might be driving their behavior.
That's powerful. It requires a lot of empathy,
It does.
a willingness to look beyond the surface.
And it's important to acknowledge this doesn't mean condoning harmful actions or excusing bad behavior.
Right.
Forgiveness doesn't erase the consequences of our choices.
Right. So it's not about pretending that the hurt didn't happen.
Not at all. It's about choosing to release the bitterness and resentment
Okay.
that keep us bound to the pain.
Yeah.
Breaking free from that cycle of hurt.
Yeah.
And opening ourselves up to the possibility of healing and reconciliation.
But what if the person who hurt us isn't remorseful? What if they don't ask for forgiveness?
Yeah.
Do we still offer it?
This is where the concept of God's pursuit of his bride
Okay.
becomes particularly relevant.
Okay.
Remember, God didn't wait for Israel to get their act together
Right.
before offering them his love and forgiveness.
Right.
He pursued them relentlessly,
Yeah.
even when they were actively rejecting him.
So that suggests that our forgiveness isn't contingent upon the other person's response.
Precisely, and that's where the true transformative power of forgiveness lies.
Wow.
It's not about letting the other person off the hook.
Right.
It's about freeing ourselves from the burden of anger and resentment.
Right.
Choosing to align ourselves with God's heart of compassion, even when it feels so incredibly difficult.
This makes me think of Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
Absolutely. That teaching encapsulates the radical nature of Christian love.
Yeah.
It's a love that transcends our human limitations and taps into this supernatural source of grace.
But let's be real. Loving our enemies is easier said than done.
Oh, it is.
It's a tall order, especially when we're grappling with deep hurt
You're right, it is.
and betrayal.
It's a process, a journey,
Yeah.
and we won't always get it right.
Of course.
But the fact that we're even striving to love like Hosea, like God,
Right.
is a testament to that transformative power of grace working in our lives.
So how do we practically apply this? What are some concrete steps we can take to cultivate this kind of radical love and forgiveness?
That's a great question, and it's something we'll explore further in the last part of our deep dive.
So we've talked about, living out Hosea's example and how it requires a radical shift in how we approach forgiveness.
Yeah.
But how do we actually put this into practice? It feels kind of theoretical.
You're right. It's one thing to grasp these concepts in our heads, but translating them into action is where the real work begins.
So where do we start? Give us something concrete, something we can walk away with and actually use in our lives.
One of the most practical steps, and often the hardest, is just choosing to release the bitterness.
Okay.
It's like carrying around this heavy stone,
Yeah.
It weighs you down, consumes your energy, keeps you from moving forward. Forgiving someone doesn't mean saying what they did was okay.
Right.
It's about choosing to let go of that stone, to free yourself from that burden of anger and resentment.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But how do we actually do that? It's easy to say, let go, but the emotions are so strong.
It is a process. It's not a switch we can just flip on and off,
Right.
but there are practical tools that can help.
Okay.
One that's helped me personally is journaling.
Okay.
Just writing down your thoughts and feelings, even the really ugly ones, can be so cathartic.
Yeah.
It allows you to process those emotions in a safe space.
Yeah.
Acknowledge the pain without letting it define you.
I can see how that would be helpful,
Yeah.
especially for people who internalize things.
Right.
It's like giving yourself permission to feel those emotions without being judged.
Exactly. And once you've kind of processed those feelings, you can start to shift your focus.
Okay.
Instead of dwelling on the hurt, try to recall moments of grace you've experienced.
Okay.
In your own life, remember times when you were forgiven, when
Yeah.
someone showed you compassion, when you were given a second chance.
That's interesting. So we're using the power of our own experiences to fuel our ability to forgive others. It's like reminding ourselves that we're not alone in this.
Exactly.
Grace is real.
It is. And another practical step is prayer.
Okay.
Not necessarily praying for the person who hurt you,
Right.
although that can be powerful too, but praying for yourself,
Okay.
praying for the strength to forgive,
Yeah.
for the wisdom to see the situation clearly, for the courage to release the bitterness,
Yeah.
and embrace the freedom that comes with
This
forgiveness.
all comes back to the idea that we can't do this alone, doesn't it?
It does.
We have to rely on something greater than ourselves to access that kind of love.
Yes, that's at the core of Hosea's message. True forgiveness, the kind that mirrors God's love, isn't something we achieve. It's a gift. We can't manufacture it or force it, but we can open ourselves up to receiving it, letting it flow through us into our relationships.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. It's really challenged me to rethink how I think about forgiveness and to see it as more than just a one-time action,
Yeah.
but this process of growth and transformation.
I'm glad to hear that. And I hope our listeners are feeling inspired to explore this more deeply.
Yeah.
Discover the freedom and the healing that can come from aligning ourselves with God's heart of forgiveness.
And remember, as with all of our deep dives, this is just the beginning. We encourage you to continue exploring this, to reflect on your own experiences, and to see how Hosea's story might shed light on your own journey toward deeper love and forgiveness.
And above all, remember that you're not alone in this. God's grace is always available, waiting to empower you and transform you.
Until next time, keep diving deep.